Hello everybody and welcome to this real estate live session. This one is called the Productive Valley. We're focusing on the Upper Lee Valley, a very important part of London's landscape. Real Estate Live is a week of free online events designed to keep the economic development, regeneration and inward investment conversation going at this different sort of time. We're ready, as you all know, we're running a full week of events. I'm sure you're joining in some of the others, and it's good to have you here. So thanks very much for attending. Just to kick off, we're going to run a quick poll, which we're running in all the sessions to get a kind of combined picture of what everyone thinks across the week. So I will just set that going. There we go. So now you should be able to see on your screens a poll which says, what is the most important factor in unlocking development and ensuring the continued strength of UK real estate? And there's a bunch of choices. So choose the one that you think is the best, and we'll, as I say, we'll add it all up at the end. Now, while you're doing that, I will just introduce Anne Lynn, who is the chair of the UK Innovation Corridor, who are our hosts for this session about the Productive Valley, and who is going to take you through the rest of this session. So, Anne, over to you.
Well, thank you, Ross. Thank you for arranging this, and thank you to everybody who's taking part today. This, as Ross has explained, is part of Real Estate Live, and this is the first of the 3 webinars that we're running as the UK Innovation Corridor this week. There will be one again tomorrow, the 7th of October, between 11 and 12, and that's on blended cities. Great speaker lineup there. And then the following day, on the 8th of October, Wednesday, placemaking for innovation. We're focusing today to kick things off, as you know, on the Productive Valley, the Upper Lee Valley. Look, the UK Innovation Corridor, particularly over the last 9 to 12 months, I think, has managed to, in a way, move itself forward in terms of its identity and the contributions of each of the different communities along that corridor are being strengthened by the fact that there is a common overarching geography, if you like, a regional economic geography, which was always part of the whole idea of the kind of joined upness that we've got. But within that joining up, there's also some very, very clear and distinct developments around 3 clusters of activity, if you like, and one of them very much is this Upper Lee Valley area, particularly because it combines the work of some key London boroughs, but looking outward, north as it were, up to the corridor as much as south into London. And as you will hear from the presentation that John's about to make, when you look at that, really, I think the statistics are that it's the largest contiguous industrial space in the kind of London area. The opportunities for development and support in this post-COVID economic situation are tremendous, and there's some great work being done by the boroughs, and our role is to support that. So that's what the focus is today. My role is just to kind of keep us on time and to particularly encourage and engage you after we've had John's presentation and Martin and Sarah's responses in question and answers, hopefully, and really a very engaged and informative discussion. So with that, I'm going to hand over to John McGill and keep us on time and let John make a presentation to you, which is about 15 minutes, so that you've got a shared level of knowledge of the Upper Lee Valley, and hopefully that will then stimulate the discussions and raise your questions. So John, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne, and thanks to Ross for working the slides for me. Good morning, everybody. So, as Anne said, as the UK Innovation Corridor, which very much includes the Upper Lee Valley, and you might say the idea was started from the Upper Lee Valley, as indeed many other things were. I'm going to take you through some work that we've been doing with the boroughs, with the GLA, with some businesses and investors that are either already active in the area or are interested in the area. It builds on the work that Martin Saunders developed a couple of years ago, and Martin, of course, is on the panels, which the report that remains unpublished, but is called The Productive Valley, which is the working title we're using. So I'm going to run you through this, and some of it you'll have heard before. I suspect those of you giving a great deal of thought to this area and others will say that there's nothing hugely remarkable about this, but it's just a reflection of our current work and our current thinking. So Ross, if you go to the next slide. So this is a bit of a location, the map of London showing the opportunity areas and showing the Upper Lee Valley in that block of red at the top there. And then a couple of snapshots, just showing the contrast of the Upper Lee Valley. It's, as most of you will know, it's got the Lee Valley Regional Park and the River Lee, the Lee Navigation Canal running through it. So it is very attractive, but of course it is a place of industry. And it's got a history of industry going back to the Tudor period. And like a lot of industrial areas, and you might think of Silicon Valley in this context, the Upper Lee Valley, or the Lee Valley in general, part of its history was based on armaments and munitions. We had the Waltham Abbey gunpowder mills, we have the Enfield small arms factory. These were important industries at the time, and the comparison with Silicon Valley would be if you think about Palo Alto and Lockheed. There's no getting away from the fact that armaments and munitions do drive economies, however uncomfortable that may make us feel. But from those early period in the Middle Ages and through to the 20th century, there was a lot of other activity, and the Lee Valley can rightly claim, in fact, the Upper Lee Valley can rightly claim to be at the birthplace of the modern electronics industry, with the invention of the thermionic valve, which Middlesex University tell me they still have in their exhibits. That's what used to power televisions and radios back in the days when I was a kid. You used to see them glow as they warmed up. And also Walthamstow Marshes being the location for the first powered flight in the UK, which later became the foundation of de Havilland and is now the basis of British BAE Industries, which one of their locations is further up the corridor in Stevenage. So it's got a real rich industrial heritage and real context. Of course, globalisation, rising land values, deindustrialisation, and all of those other buzzwords changed the Upper Lee Valley, again, the Lee Valley generally, through the 90s and 2000s. But then the point to make in all of this is that it's a big mistake to think that there is no industry, or that industry and manufacture hasn't got a future in the Upper Lee Valley. So Ross, if you just quickly go to the next slide, I've just put up a couple of examples, people that we've been talking to and working with. These are both in Enfield, but we could provide many other examples from the other boroughs in Haringey, Waltham Forest, Hackney, and Broxbourne, just into Hertfordshire. So Ardmore is an important construction, specialist construction located in Enfield, and building blocks, a really interesting maker space, which is a reflection of other fledgling industry growing in the Lee Valley. So as we go on to that's the context, that's the history that we're working for. Of course, like other parts of London, as that opportunity area map showed you at the beginning, the Park Royal, the Thames, the Thames estuary, and indeed the Lower Lee Valley have all changed radically. They are in a process of change as these places accommodate housing. And in fact, some of them you could almost describe as small cities within the global city that's London. And this is obviously happening in the Lee Valley. Anyone who goes through Tottenham Hale these days, Black Horse Lane, will be astonished really by the rate of change. And of course, Enfield is changing equally quickly through residential driven investment. But the Upper Lee Valley is fundamentally, and it was an industrial area. It's a place where manufacturing happened and still happens. And this heritage and history, we think, is really important, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. So these days, it's a place for manufacture of furniture, food, drink, fabrics, upcycling, recycling, a whole range of digital activity in music and film. So this, these are businesses which are there. They are in a position, many of them already growing, and certainly, despite the economic downturn, are in a position to grow. The key thing is, and this is a thing for the innovation corridor generally, is that we must make sure that there's space to accommodate this. So obviously residential homes for residents is very important. London's got huge challenges to accommodate its population. And of course, those new residents will expect levels of service commensurate with the early part of the 21st century, looking forward to the middle of the 21st century when some of these sites become fully developed. So that in itself implies employment, last mile delivery. We've got to think about how we address that without getting ever more vehicles on the street. So there's the manufacturing, there's the industrial thread, but there's also employment that's generated through residential development, and that will also contribute to the employment through along the valley. So this leads us to think about how we can accommodate this, and concepts such as the 15-minute city, where everything is within walking and cycling distance. These are not exactly new ideas, but they're certainly getting currency. So these are all the thoughts that we're having to mill around and think about in the context of COVID, Brexit, let's not forget, and of course climate change. And just a quick plug for we've got a session tomorrow. Anne mentioned that we've got 3 sessions this week. Our second session tomorrow is on the blended city, which is a slightly different term, and looks at how the corridor might adapt in the new world of COVID and post-pandemic, but not necessarily post-COVID, how that might work in the innovation corridor, and how places like the Upper Lee Valley could benefit from some of that change in working patterns and shopping patterns and so forth. So anyway, so it's actually quite difficult to think of places that are better positioned than the Upper Lee Valley. It is actually an area of great opportunity. Clues in the title. The London plan has regarded it as an opportunity area for a number of years. In fact, going back to the very first London plan. The actual interventions by government are relatively modest. They're not insignificant, but they're relatively modest. And it's one of the things we've been calling on to the government is to act as cornerstone investor, to be more active, not necessarily to pay for everything, but send that signal to investors that this is a place with a future, and the government recognises. So very quickly on COVID, I'm not going to get into armchair epidemiology, but of course COVID is changing things very, very rapidly. Often it's boosting trends that are already present. And so that needs to factor into our thinking about the Upper Lee, not just the local jobs and local services, but what we might call full service economies, which are offering jobs which would be more akin to a central business district. And that might make us think about implications for Crossrail 2 and how the case for that was predicated largely on moving areas of high residential into the central business district. Now we might need to think about that differently We know it's not uppermost in the government priorities, but the case for it won't go away. We might need to think about how we make this differently. So then, if we start to think about how we approach this, what we're suggesting is that we need a vision. So, of course, everybody suggests we need a vision, and we've all seen a few visions, not least for the Upper Lee Valley over the years. What we're trying to suggest on this one is we do it slightly differently, is that we really nail down and agree amongst the key stakeholders, the civic responsibility of the boroughs, working with the GLA. And when I say boroughs, I essentially mean Enfield, Haringey, Wharf and Forest, but also Hackney, and also the borough of Broxbourne, because this landscape does go across the London boundary, and we shouldn't forget that, because it's quite important and it does give us opportunities. So this vision should be outcome led. We should use and think through the policy levers and investment approaches that we want to use to achieve that set of outcomes. We need to think 20 years or so ahead, and the area we might want to see, which is smart, efficient, mixed-use neighbourhoods, and of course, which will be zero carbon. As I said, we need to restate the case for Crossrail 2. I think we might need to do that differently, but I don't think we should be shy about making that case. Not forgetting the important work that boroughs such as Enfield are doing on improving the West Anglia line. We can't just stand still while we do all of this. This work must go on. But the real issue is that this needs to be a collaboration. It needs to be a collaboration led by the boroughs with the GLA supporting, but it needs to include local businesses with investors, so that we can develop ideas in real time, so that we're not just coming up with ideas that won't wash their face or won't carry authority within the investment community. And then the last point on this is that we need to be flexible and agile. The pandemic has demonstrated how quickly things can change and be disrupted. So this doesn't mean to say that we're anticipating the pandemic too often. Let's hope that's true. But what it's underscored is the rate of change and how quickly things can change. But as I've said, there will be other economic shocks, Brexit being one of them, that will promote change, and of course climate change, which kind of overrides all of these things. So we can start to think about areas where we can draw ideas, not too important slavishly, but to think about other places where they've changed their industry, they've changed their landscape. So Ross, if you go to the next slide, and just so one here is Amid in Sheffield. That's the manufacturing innovation district in Sheffield. It's a response to the demise or the changing steel industry in Sheffield. So there are lessons we could draw from there. Next slide, Ross. Emscher Park in Germany. This is a perennial. Every time I've ever spoken about the Upper Lee Valley, people say you should have a look at Emscher Park in the Ruhr Valley in Germany. You can obviously understand the rationale. It's an industrial area set in parkland, so there's obviously connections there. But actually, go to the next slide, Ross. Far closer to home, of course, is the Lower Lee Valley, and the change that's happening very, very rapidly there. There are lessons we can draw from that area, and in its own way, that's driving change up the valley into the Upper Lee Valley. So very quickly, in conclusion, so that's the last slide, Ross. We're saying that the productive valley concept is built and based on historic and industrial context of the Lee Valley. And we think that's really important. We shouldn't lose sight of that. So it's a place for employment, local, but also possibly business space and industry. But it needs to make its case for a stronger vision about what employment and industry should look like as we go through the early part of this century into the middle of the century. But it must be integrated and complementary to the new residential placemaking, which is happening. And then the final point is, and this is one I made earlier, but I want to reinforce this, that it's really got to come forward with the boroughs taking the lead, with the GLA landowners, investors and business working together to agree that vision and how that should complement the placemaking which is currently underway. So that's my presentation. Sorry, I've gone slightly over time. So I'll hand back to you, Anne, as chair. Thank you.
No, thank you, John. You've done well with the time and very clear, reminding us of the history, but actually using that as a springboard to what we could be in the future. So turning to Sarah first for a response to that. Sarah's leading with her local authority leader, Councillor Calliscam, major development in London Borough of Enfield. As you have heard, that's a key borough in this collaboration with Waltham Forest, Haringey, Hackney and Broxbourne. So Sarah, your thoughts on what you've heard from John?
Hello, hi. I'm Sarah Carey. I'm the Executive Director for Place at Enfield Council. And I think John's done a really good job of setting the kind of scene for the Upper Lee and its potential. It is really well connected, and it's and we get told that actually by quite a lot of our businesses who when we speak with them about, they really value its train and its road connections and its ability to be a sort of gateway for London for the rest of the UK. Our goal over the next, our goal is, as a kind of council, is to help our existing businesses grow and attract new businesses, particularly for the corridor and the kind of industrial areas in the valley. This means that a transition, probably over some time, from an economy which is has quite fairly low jobs density and often very low wage jobs. It's something which is a more productive end of a kind of innovation corridor of manufacturing and the potential for that. So this is not going to happen overnight. We know that, but it is a long-term vision that the council has. And part of that, of course, is our own, what we ourselves are doing through a council-led large-scale regeneration project called Meridian Water, which is in the southern bit of Enfield, which is very close to the border with Haringey and with Waltham Forest. And that's an area where we are moving to transform some industrial land, but not all of that within the project area, into a much more mixed-use economy. Now that it's going to have housing, but also quite a lot of what we call makerspace or modern workspace as part of it. And we've got some great examples of that in things like Building Blocks, which is an existing kind of co-working space for people who make things, and how they sort of have memberships and people can come and work there, whether it's making film sets for film studios that are also happening up and down and across London, or whether it's making joinery or cabinetry or much more modern kind of technological things. They do have quite a big range of different tools that you can use. And we're helping them to grow as part of the future for Meridian Water. So just trying to say that there's a long-term vision for the Productive Valley, but clearly some things we're trying to do in the short and medium term that the council's leading on. I do want to touch on COVID just immediately. John also mentioned it as well. A lot of Enfield's industrial businesses are actually doing very well. Some of them are quite a lot of them are logistics businesses. We have Waitrose opened a new fulfillment centre from North London about a month and a half ago in Enfield, and that is looking to scale up quite quickly in terms of its operations and employment, which is really good news. But also we've got a lot of food manufacturers. Some of them make food for kind of consumer sale like Greggs, which might be a bit more struggling, but JJ Foods and Arla and other kind of more wholesale food businesses are continuing to do incredibly well during this time. So looking to the next couple of years, we hope that can kind of grow and continue to expand. But we're trying to find a way and open to really discussions, and as John said, learning from other examples across the UK and internationally about how to, over time, transform our area, but also Waltham Forest and Haringey's area of the Productive Valley into something which is more, has a greater jobs density and also higher wage jobs. And that could be quite a few different sectors. I don't think, we're not very quite sector agnostic at this stage. But we, there are a couple different things I can think of that we would like to see and like to encourage. So I think that's all I was going to open with now. I'm really, there's some lots of, I think we've got some structured questions later, which about how we can learn from, or specifically what are the local planning policies meaning and stuff. But let's get to that. I thought I'd just set you the scene for now.
Yeah, no, that's great, Sarah. Thank you for doing that. And that probably is a very good way into Martin for a few reflections. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I suppose, interesting taking John's starting point, which is to sort of leap straight into the Upper Lee Valley and talking about the area as the whole Upper Lee Valley rather than its constituents or political boundaries. And I suppose it's something that when we did the original work a few years ago, we reflected on quite hard with the boroughs and other stakeholders around why is that important? Why is it important to communicate the strength and the opportunities of the valley from a valley perspective? And I think actually some of that is about the simplicity of that message. And if you dial it back to its simplest level, the businesses that are in the Upper Lee Valley, to a large degree, do not associate themselves and do not necessarily make their location decisions because they want to be in Enfield or because they want to be in Waltham Forest or Haringey. They make that business decision, they make that investment decision because of the attributes of the area they're moving into. It is the transport infrastructure, it is the connectivity, and particularly with some of the distribution businesses Sarah was just talking about, it is that proximity to people. It's the ability to service central London, but also be that gateway to the rest of the country or from the rest of the country. As John mentioned in his presentation, that also leads us into a really interesting situation in the Valley today, where what we have is the biggest concentration of industrial activity and floor space in London without any presence in and of itself in the market. Yes, we understand that there's a Brimsdown area or there's a Lea Bridge area or there's a Tottenham area, but actually it doesn't quite punch the weight it's got when you compare it to somewhere like Park Royal, which covers 4 boroughs, but nobody thinks about the constituent boroughs. And to be fair, I had to remind myself this morning what they were. They just think of Park Royal as the largest contiguous urban industrial estate in Europe. So I think there's something we can learn there about the future of the valley and the benefits that you can get from starting to think about it from that more strategic level. Clearly, it's not hermetically sealed. Clearly, it's something where already those businesses are cross-pollinating. But if we think about Sarah's aspiration for the future and how we grow an economy and how we upskill a population and allow them to access higher value jobs, the pieces of that puzzle do not lie within one borough. Yes, there's a workforce across there, but actually the education and training is cross-borough. The businesses are cross-borough. The actual supply chain linkages are cross-borough. So we need to think about the valley as that kind of economic organism more than just a series of sort of local planning authorities. I think the other big asset that has been mentioned a number of times, particularly by John, is the wetlands. That very valuable resource that we have within the valley, which is truly cross-boundary. It literally runs down the boundaries of all of the constituent boroughs. But it's the thing that will provide both the choice for people who want to live in the area in the future. It's that lifestyle choice, it's that quality of environment that people are seeking, but also in terms of increased business awareness of well-being, sustainability, and their ability to attract talent in the future. It becomes a key asset, which has been developed as a concept and delivered as a concept cross-boundary, and that sort of demonstrates the success of working together. I think the other key benefit and where this can lead is around case making for investment. So certainly looking at the case for Crossrail 2 or other major infrastructure, you understand the implications across a wider economic geography, helps make the case for the benefits it can deliver and the challenges that it overcomes. Because clearly, if you improve that connectivity through the Crossrail 2 corridor, you're actually having a whole series of knock-on impacts to feeder stations, to the road network, which will then benefit other, maybe not directly accessible, but other parts of the valley. I think the other thing we can do really powerfully at the valley level, and this is the really important piece going forward, is we can share success. We can actually communicate the successes. We've talked about a number of individual projects have already been mentioned today, whether that's building blocks, or whether that's some of the Meridian water development that's coming forward in Enfield, whether that's some of the higher value businesses, sort of creative businesses that we see in South Tottenham. Those critical success factors, when communicated at a bigger level and start to join together, start to tell a different story about the economy. It becomes less about you know, the big sheds you see from the M25 as you go into the north of the valley. It becomes more about the high value businesses, the skills and training offer. And I think that's really the powerful message that you get at the valley level that maybe you can lose when you go into the individual boroughs. So I think looking ahead, that can make us more successful in terms of attracting inward investment. That can make us more successful in terms of securing investment for infrastructure. But I think it's also about enabling the businesses that are already here to be more successful, more productive, and therefore provide greater benefits for the population that lives and works in the valley as well.
Martin, thank you so much. And actually, that, I think, if I could start as an opening point for the discussion, probably leads into a question that we've actually had from Councillor Seaby, who you may know is a councillor in Broxbourne. Certainly John and I know that. And he says, how do we ensure that Waltham Cross in Hertfordshire, i.e. Broxbourne, doesn't get left out? Things seem to be led by GLA London. I don't think that is the case personally, but I think it's very important, given what Sarah has said and what Martin said, to go back, John, to your opening slides and the call to action. This has to be a collaborative venture, and it certainly, in our eyes, as Innovation Corridor, very much includes Broxbourne. Now, the difficulty for local authorities in the world we live in is that there's so many overlapping and interlocking geographies. I know that makes it really difficult for people to manage the strategic picture. It's very demanding on officers' time, it's demanding on leaders' time, it's confusing for businesses. But actually, going back to the points Martin's just made, we have to kind of live with those ecosystems and that what I call variable geography, if we are to meet businesses' needs, bring investment in, and actually help shape the government's agenda, in my view. So it does mean playing very often in 2 or 3 different pools, and making those work for the benefits of the communities and the businesses that we want to succeed. So with that intervention from me, John, do you want to just pick up, and then Martin or Sarah could add anything to that, picking up Paul's point? And then please do raise your hand. I think everybody knows about how to kind of do this now in the chat function or the Q&A, and I'll keep an eye on that. Over to you, John.
Yeah, thanks, Anne, and hello, Paul. I mean, in many ways, you make the case for. I'm not going to duck the opportunity for the importance of the innovation corridor and Anne, in that, as you say, how do we make sure that Waltham Cross doesn't miss out on this? Well, that's exactly the right point, because the landscape, the economic geography, does include Broxbourne, it does include Waltham Cross, and the way to do that and to make sure that is considered and brought into the conversation, and the opportunities that can provide for Waltham Cross and the solutions that might provide to some of the other London boroughs, is because Broxbourne is in that conversation. And at an officer level, which is where it is at the moment, that's already happening. But as Anne has hinted, at some point, providing that we get enough wind in our sails, and this event is to some extent testing that, the strength of that wind, is that we want to convene a meeting of the leadership to really get behind that. And I would absolutely want Lewis to be involved in that as the leader of Broxbourne. So that's our thinking. I mean, we can go beyond that and start thinking about how we engage with businesses, but I think it's a bit of an early stage to be able to name names. But those are my initial thoughts. And you know, as we've always said from the outset of the concept behind the innovation corridor, it's about the economic geography. It's not about municipal boundaries, however big and fixed and important they are to get people voting and all the rest of it. So that's my pitch.
Paul, do you want, I hope that has reassured you. Do you want to, if you want to add anything to that, can you add it into the chat box, because I don't think we can bring people in live, can we? I'm just checking that with Ross, who I hope is still there. Whilst we're just sort of checking that out, can I draw your attention to some very, as ever, thoughtful reflections from Mark Gray that the panellists, he sent them just to the panellists, might want to pick up. But there's also, because I realise from Ross now we can't bring people in to make this more interactive, but we can get panellists to answer questions. So perhaps the panellists can just have a look at the comments from Mark. But we've also had a question from Emma Wilcox, who leads on the cultural development for the Thames Estuary Production Corridor. And if you go back to John's map at the beginning, in a sense, that's, if you're looking at the north-south radial corridor of the Lee Valley, the Upper Lee Valley, the Lower Lee Valley, of course, if you go off to the east, we're then totally connected with Thames Estuary and a huge amount of development there. So Emma's actually asking us how we in the Innovation Corridor in the Upper Lee Valley cover the issue that they're in more than one LEP area. I think if I start with an answer to that, Emma, and then it gives time for John and perhaps Sarah to come in, and Martin might have a view on it. You know, again, this is just an acceptance of the regional economic geography and the structures that exist in the country at the moment and are probably not going to change. LEPs are here, and they have their boundaries and they do their job, and they are very important in terms of private sector and local authority sector relationships. How you create other and work with other entities, if you like, around that is actually by being, I think, by being big tent and collaborative. You acknowledge the individual role, you take the resources from them, you work with the LEPs that you connect with. So actually we work very well with the Hertfordshire LEP, with the South East LEP, which of course covers Essex and then goes through the Thames Estuary Partnership and down into Kent and East Sussex. And equally, the Innovation Corridor as a whole, of course, is part of working with these great cities of London and Cambridge, where you have a mayoral combined authority with business boards that are LEPs. So it's actually about finding, this is probably my words to what Martin has said and what John and Sarah have said as well, but kind of the areas of common interest, shared language, shared need around a particular set of activities that will attract money and resources and delivery. And if you can do that around a region that has coherence, there's a place for the LEPs within that. Does anybody from the panel want to come in onto that? And I'll just look for the next questions.
I'll add to that, but I'd be very interested in Sarah Martin's reflection on this, because in a sense this is very much our daily challenge, Anne, and you've articulated that extremely well. The way I would do this, and I think we're saying the same thing, is that the way, for me, in an entity like the Innovation Corridor, which is not statutory, it's not government driven, it's bottom up, it was entirely voluntary membership, is because you know, and I'm sort of saying what you said in a slightly different way, is it's because there's a compelling narrative. And that's, for me, that's the thing that always provides the leadership, or the kind of the pulpit for leadership, if I can put it like that, because there is a narrative which people understand and they've signed up to. But I sort of come back to what Martin said, comparing. There's an interesting comparison he makes between Park Royal and the Upper Lee Valley, because I think that's quite a telling observation from, forgive me, Martin, an outsider. You're not really, I mean, we've done a lot of work with you, but you know what I mean. Is why is it that Park Royal is known as Park Royal, and he had to look at the map to know which boroughs it's in, whereas people don't think about the Lee Valley, still less the Upper Lee Valley, in the same way. And I think that has been one of the things that have possibly held the area back. So it's, you know, I think it's an interesting observation. One I agree with, and I think we need to think about why that is. And I think that possibly is because the narrative hasn't been strong enough.
Yeah, Let's come on. I think, Sarah, you might want to pick up on the changes potentially to planning. Will that assist in the way in which some of the points that have been raised can be tackled?
Yeah, I'm happy to pick up on that. If you don't mind, I'm going to pick up on it by responding to Mark Gray's observation around deindustrialization and kind of evolution of industrial areas. And I really agree with what he's saying, that there's a lot of potential for change that's not about deindustrialization. And actually, the phrase in planning is often intensification of land use, because the challenge for all of London, but particularly areas with lots of industrial land, is how do you make those bits of industrial land more multi-purpose? And that could be, and as the use that's changed there, as a sector that's using it changes, if it doesn't need, logistics will always need large format areas with high traffic, but you could also build above them. But there are other kinds of industrial uses which can be integrated into cities with some thought, into more urban areas with some thought. And that is the challenge for us, and I think the challenge for planning. And I'm not sure that at the moment the GLA's currently London plan policies encourage intensification. They do allow for it, but I'm not sure they encourage it. And that's something that we're trying to give some thought to in our own local plan policies and in discussions with Waltham Forest and Haringey about how we can encourage continuation and actually expansion of industrial forest space, but also the other, we also need homes, we need public spaces, we need leisure areas, and those industrial areas need to be more knitted into the kind of what I would think called the fabric of a city. And I think if you look at Lee Valley in particular, in the long term, I can't imagine government, if we do go ahead with Crossrail 2, wanting to put a very expensive new train line up the middle of an area which might only have robots moving, Amazon packages around. I'm being a little bit extreme here, but I don't think that's what government wants to do. And I don't think that's what we want to do. So we now need to look at how industrial land is changing and how those uses are changing and how we can make those uses function in an environment that's also really good for other things. So there are always going to be areas of industrial land which are noisy or smelly or are not suitable for residents and other things to happen near them. But that doesn't mean that lots of what we have in the Lee Valley can't be done like that. And as John said, we've got some really great other attributes in the Lee Valley. We've got some really lovely natural environment. We've got great access to the countryside and the parks, which we can make more of. So I think the challenge is how we can do that. So some of them, going back to planning a little bit more, I think it will be interesting to see what the already brought in changes around the use class E might mean for the Lee Valley. The land in that area is still at a currently rented area. It's cheaper than a town centre, so I'm not expecting. You might see some things drift to that to the to some of our industrial land. We might see more food retail and things drift that way, but I'm not expecting to see kind of more industrial uses moving into our town centres just because of the way current land values are. But we'll see over time. I don't think it has the exact same problem that areas outside London which have really high levels of out-of-town retail do, where you already have a fairly good visitor environment, and you already have a kind of consumer-facing setup. Those places might suddenly have lots of housing, or maybe not housing, but might have lots of other uses, might have restaurants and might have offices and things being added to them. Whereas I'm not sure I can quite show that seeing that happen on Mollison Avenue, but just because of the kind of environment of it is. But if we improve that environment, it'd be interesting to see over the next couple of years, and we will be monitoring that closely. And if anyone's got any ideas about that, really, I'm personally really keen to hear from people about that. So that's in the kind of stuff that government's already brought in. If you look at what they're trying to do with planning reform in the long term, it raises a lot of questions about land designations more generally, because I don't even think you might not even have strategic industrial land or you might have protect for industrial only, which also is not necessarily what London wants. So I think we need to, everyone's been saying about it, but those designations need to kind of be more nuanced to allow for the complexity of urban areas. And I think, as a opportunity area already in London. Us at the three boroughs have already put our heads together quite a lot on what we think the land planning policy should be and how we should encourage intensification. But welcome. I mean, I'm interested to see what the chat says about this as well. So.
Thank you, Sarah. There are, just for the benefits of all the participants, I have now put Mark, I think I have put Mark Gray's points into the, I hope I've put it into the right bit. This is a, you know, a nightmare of multitasking, isn't it? So you could see what Sarah was picking up there, as well as going on to the planning point, for which I'm grateful. Martin, anything you want to add in at this point? Otherwise, I've got a couple of other questions as well that have sneakily been put in by two people we know, Stephen King and Del Goddard. So I'll go on to those.
Yeah, just very quickly, going back to the first point about geography, and yes, not particularly embedded in the relationships between all of the institutions in the area. I have the joy of working with most of them at time to time, but not having to necessarily get caught up in the machinations. But I think it goes back to the point I was trying to make earlier, which is the geography should be flexible. The geography should fit the purpose of what you're trying to do. So to bring in Waltham Cross, for example, if we are talking about a conversation about infrastructure and industry, there is no delineation in industry's minds, other than possibly the business rates regimes or something, between being in Broxbourne or being in Enfield in terms of, you know, the benefits they have and their ability to service markets in London. So I think that's the key point about bringing them in. And I think it's making that case really clear. So when we're dealing with multiple LEPs, and I remember working with John a number of years ago where we were actually, as LEPs were formed, we were, you know, pontificating about the fact that the whole valley is at the intersection of two LEPs, and does that mean actually you're not important to either of them because you're at that weird hinterland? So I think, you know, if you can make the narrative, and we keep using that word, but if you can make the case that there's a reason for this geography to exist, it makes, in the way we're talking today, it makes fundamental economic sense, and that's what drives success, then that should bring in those conversations. It may be driven by London because, let's be honest, a lot of the UK economy is driven by London. My northern colleagues might have a word with me about that later, but that's the way the corridor economy is driven. It's driven by the fact you can service London, essentially. I think in terms of the future of industry, I think that's fascinating. It's one of the things that we really focused on in the Productive Valley report, and I wish more people had the chance to look at that and question us on it, because that's where we see the evolution going. Yes, we've got big box distribution, but that isn't what it used to be. That isn't lots of people walking around picking up goods and sticking them in a box. You know, the level of automation, the robotics, the software engineering, John gets bored of me saying this, but they're the sorts of things that drive the next wave of the economy. They're going to be, you know, the next demand in the Upper Lee Valley should be for robotics engineers. It should be for data software process. If you combine that with Ada in Tottenham, you've got the perfect ecosystem for a labour pool and a supply chain to bring those businesses in. If that should be part of the strategy. So I think absolutely agree with the points made about Industry 4.0. There's a lot we can do. It leads to Sarah's point about integrating industry into urban environments. You only have to look at Future Works in New York to see how that can be done. So I think there's lots we can learn, but also fundamentally, there's lots in the valley to work with. It's not like we're, you know, I'm doing a lot of work in the Thames corridor, similar environment, but possibly a little bit further behind in some of the assets it's got to build from, particularly in maybe the Kent part of that corridor.
Mm. Interesting. Great, Martin. Thank you. I'm just going to take these two quick questions, or I hope quick answers. One from Stephen King on airports. Panelists, I don't know whether you have seen it, but I think that if I just read it out so that everybody else can hear it, if I can now find it. Do we think that airports are not the same economic driver that we once thought they were? So just bear that in mind. Also, you'll have seen on that chat a very supportive point backing up what Sarah said. The panelists have seen this anyway, from Tom Holbrook, who is speaking tomorrow, I think, or the next day. So thank you for that. I'll post Tom's comment in so that everybody sees it. So there's the airport one, and then Del Goddard, if I just ask you this one as well. Flexibility seems to be an essential principle, as picking winners is problematic. Distribution is related to geography and servicing London. but is there not a case for more and better sets of premises for small self-employed activity across the whole area and not just the east of the A10 to reduce travel? Anyway, you're over to who wants to pick either of those up? John, do you want to start?
Yeah, well, you're the chair, Anne, so I will. Stephen King's point about airports. Yeah, I mean, that's a fascinating topic and you know, very, very pertinent question, Stephen. I mean, they're sure as hell aren't an economic driver at the moment, although it's interesting that because Stansted retained its capacity and its, you know, its location as a freight airport, that's been really, really helpful to them. I think they would have struggled even more if they hadn't had that. And you know, they are growing that business. But you know, I'm no expert on this. You know, airports are going to struggle. You know, as I've said, and it's not, I don't claim any insight into this. COVID is driving change far faster than anybody ever dreamt or feared. And, you know, the low carbon or non-carbon flight transport has got to happen. Now, so that's one trajectory. The other trajectory is that as we learn to live with the virus and, you know, we emerge with a different way of doing things, no doubt, international travel, I don't think is going to go away. You know, this might take 3, 4, 5 years to emerge, but I can't see that it won't emerge. How quickly Stansted gets back on its trajectory of 28 million or so going north, I don't know, but it is interesting to note that in the early part of next year, they are going ahead with their planning application, their appeal for best use, as they put it, of the single runway. So this, to me, is interesting. It doesn't mean they're right, but, you know, they're backing this with money. Now, I'm not, you know, that if only in terms of the resource they're going to have to put into a planning appeal. So I think it's worth noting that. Now, whether that's an act of faith, insight, or you know, kind of we don't know what else to do, so let's do that, I really don't know. But I think it's interesting.
Somebody, sorry, Martin, go on. Yeah.
So the other angle on airports is, yes, there's sort of mass volume tourism, and when that recovers is obviously important. I think that the freight thing's interesting. I suppose what's the bigger driver of the probably a challenge that was facing the aviation industry anyway, which is people's changing perspectives on sustainability and environmental objectives. So actually, if we think about airports as not a place you go to travel, but as an economic entity again, there's a lot of innovation that's got to happen in the aviation industry going forward to suit people's lifestyle choices and the way that the population is changing those priorities. So people will always want to travel. They'll always want to go to other places, but they'll potentially not want to have such a big carbon footprint doing it. I suspect that is going to be a longer term trend than anything we've seen from COVID response lockdowns and travel bans. So therein lies another interesting opportunity for an economy, which is who is doing the innovation in terms of fuel, in terms of engines, in terms of plane design to make them more efficient. Where's that happening? What are the skills you need to do that? What are the businesses actually, industrial businesses, industrial design businesses that can help that happen? So there may be a different way of it happening. It may look and feel different, but I suspect that airports will come back as a key consideration, not least because we will still have a very international economy.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to see if we can get any response to Del Goddard. And then the very last question I'm going to pick up on is from John Baldwin, because I think that actually leads us to a good point to conclude things on, which we will promptly at 12 o'clock, folks. Anybody want to pick up on Del's point?
Well, I'll have a go, but I'd be interested to hear what Sarah's got to say on this. But yeah, so my point, and I haven't got Del's question open in front of me, but I tried to make this point in my presentation. Flexibility and agility, I think are, I think they've always been important, but I think they've become more important. And I suppose the thing that struck me over the years, or over the recent couple of years, is that some of these things, if it's designed in the right way, big boxes which, you know, one year could be used for distribution, another time could be divided into small business spaces. You know, for me, and you know, I am not an architect, and my design credentials are pretty minimal. But if I go to Harlow and I see the science park there, and I go to some of the big boxes that have emerged in Meridian Water, I don't see a huge difference. But it just, you know, obviously there are different things going on inside them. So it's that agility to repurpose buildings, I think, which partly answers Bill. I don't think entirely answers his point, but I'd be very interested in, you know, the planner's view. And I know you're a lot more than a planner these days, Sarah, but you've got a better insight on planning than I have.
Due to my complete mismanagement of these two panels, plus watching and listening to you, never mind everybody else, Sarah didn't have Dell's question, but I have just sent it to her. But flexibility seems to be an essential principle.
The principle.
Yeah, you got it there. Just a quick comment, Sarah, and then I'll end with John's point.
So I mean, Dell's making the point that we need to not just look at east of the A10, and I, you know, personally, and from a kind of corporate perspective, we wholeheartedly agree with that, particularly when we're looking at town centre intensification. If you think about the town centres in Enfield and Haringey and in Waltham Forest and up the innovation corridor as well, these places are going to look very different and in a very short space of time. I think it is unlikely that many of the retailers will survive they'll survive to Christmas, and then we will see closures after that. And we need to find ways of encouraging reuse of those high streets. And some of that is around just having the more planning flexibility that now exists. For example, you can become a restaurant, you can become a yoga studio, you can become a workspace, and you can become a light manufacturing workspace quite easily as well. I look forward to seeing, I suspect the number of breweries and distilleries in Enfield will probably grow. As long as they're on the high street and they're also selling food and they've got some activity, I think that's probably pretty good. But I think this will happen pretty quickly. And I think that actually the changes in the high streets that are coming and our town centres that are coming is probably quite a good thing for people who are looking to, and businesses that are looking for additional premises. We've got some quite well located ones as well. They're not, and that location does matter. So the changes in the use class just mean that flexibility is now it's just there now in a lot of ways. And there will be some negative impacts of that, but it's also a positive thing as well.
Great, thank you, Sarah, for doing that. So with just a minute to go, I'm going to use the privilege of being in the chair here and to just draw attention to John's question about the fact that the Upper Lee Valley concept has been around and it has had some success, but as he says, perhaps not the attention that it deserves, especially in comparison, and Martin made this point, to other areas in London like Park Royal. There's something unique about the Upper Lee Valley, I think, and that is to go back to the point Councillor Seaby made, which is it does go into Hertfordshire and it looks north up the innovation corridor, and the boroughs that are engaged from London actually have a foot in London, but they also have a head and a heart going up this corridor. So the answer to the question, and this was the purpose of this event really, is that we go back to that Upper Lee Valley Productive Valley report that Martin produced. We get that vision re-energized, as it were, by getting the local authority leaders absolutely behind that, so that there is a compelling narrative, there is a purpose, and we share that purpose, and we make and sell the case to the advantage of all the partners engaged, but within an overall clear strategic context and vision. And I think the resources will then flow. So that is our intention, isn't it, John? Having, I hope, raised the issue today, to use our convening power to take this forward to that call for action in John's slide. And I hope, John Baldwin, you will be supportive of that, as everybody else on this call. So it doesn't stop here. This is just the beginning of another journey. Thank you all for attending. And at that point, I thank the panelists for their contributions and for their time. Thank you to all of you for participating. And I'll just hand over to Ross to end us at 12. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anne, and thanks all speakers for a really interesting, useful discussion, and to all the attendees for your engagement. That's one of the best, most engaged audiences that we've had this week for Real Estate Live. So well done, everybody. I will just briefly share the results of the poll. I think you should now all be able to see the results of the poll. Investment in transport infrastructure and social infrastructure and a skilled workforce come out top. So interesting stuff. We'll add them to the results of the rest. Very briefly, if you like industrial, there's been a lot of talk of that. There's a session this afternoon about Southwest London, different part of the world. And if you like zero carbon, we've had some chat about that. You'll find that also this afternoon there's a London and Partners session about moving towards zero carbon. If you like the UK Innovation Corridor, which I do, obviously, and Anne does and John does, and I know everyone in the audience does, we have a session called Blended Cities tomorrow, featuring Professor Greg Clark, which will educate and inform, I hope. That's it. Thank you for engaging in Real Estate Live. Thank you to the speakers. Thank you to the delegates. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.